The night of February 11th, 1943, South Pacific waters, near the Solomon Islands. Commander Kiyoshi Harada stood in the conning tower of the Imperial Japanese Navy submarine the WWII-18, his hands steady on cold steel despite the fear crawling up his spine. Above him, stars dotted the blackness. Below, 300 feet of dark water waited like a grave. His crew had surfaced to recharge batteries, a routine they had performed dozens of times before, always safely cloaked by night's embrace. Then the sound began, not the familiar rush of waves or the distant rumble of storms. This was different. A rhythmic pulse, faint but growing stronger. Ping. Pause. Ping. Each echo sent ripples of dread through the hull. The sonar operator's voice cracked through the intercom, barely a whisper, as if speaking louder might make them more visible to whatever hunted them in the dark. Destroyer. American. Range. Approximately 2,000 yards. 2,000 yards. In darkness. So complete that even their excellent night binoculars revealed nothing but empty ocean. Yet somehow, impossibly, the Americans had found them. The ocean, once their sanctuary, had become a traitor. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Commander Harada couldn't know, what no Japanese submarine commander yet fully understood, was that the rules of underwater warfare had been rewritten in American shipyards. A new class of destroyer, sleek, fast, and equipped with technology that turned night into day and silence into speech, had arrived in the Pacific. They were called the Fletcher-Class, and they were hunting with eyes that could see through darkness and ears that could hear through steel. Before that night, Japanese submarines had owned the Pacific's depths. They were the apex predators of an underwater realm where concealment meant survival and darkness meant safety. Since the war's opening salvos, Imperial Navy submarines had prowled these waters with impunity, surfacing under cover of night to recharge their diesel batteries, confident that human eyes couldn't penetrate the black. Their doctrine, their training, everything they'd learned about submarine warfare told them one simple truth: if you couldn't be seen, you couldn't be killed. That doctrine had been written in an older age. The Fletcher-class destroyers emerged from American naval yards beginning in 1942, the first of 175 identical ships that would pour from 11 different shipyards in a manufacturing miracle. Each vessel stretched 376 feet in length, displaced 2,500 tons, and could reach 37 knots fast enough to run down any submarine attempting to escape on the surface. But speed alone wasn't revolutionary. Every navy had fast destroyers. What made the Fletchers different was invisible. Mounted below each destroyer's hull sat a QC series sonar transducer, a magnetostrictive device that could pulse sound waves through water and listen for their return. The technology wasn't new. Navies had experimented with underwater sound detection since the First World War. But by the early 1940s, American engineers had refined active sonar to a precision that stunned even its operators. Under favorable conditions, a Fletcher's sonar could detect a submerged submarine at ranges approaching 2,500 yards. Even in rougher seas, detection remained reliable out to 1,500 yards. To put that in perspective, a Japanese submarine commander accustomed to visual detection ranges measured in hundreds of feet now faced an enemy that could see him from nearly a mile and a half away, through pitch-black water, in the middle of the night. But sonar was only half the equation. Atop each Fletcher's superstructure sat an SG surface search radar, a technological marvel that Japanese submariners barely understood and wouldn't effectively counter until 1944, far too late. This radar could sweep the ocean's surface in any weather, day or night, detecting objects the size of a submarine conning tower at ranges exceeding 10 miles. When Japanese submarines surfaced to recharge batteries, a practice essential to their diesel-electric propulsion, they became radar targets visible across vast stretches of otherwise empty ocean. The Americans had done something unprecedented. They had given their destroyers the ability to hunt submarines without seeing them. Japanese submarine doctrine, refined over 2 decades of training and combat, emphasized the decisive fleet engagement, the Kantai Kessen, the great battle that would decide the war in a single afternoon. Submarines were scouts first, attackers of warships second. They shadowed enemy fleets, reported positions, and struck at capital ships when opportunities arose. Merchantmen, slow and poorly defended, weren't priorities. The mission was to wear down the American battle line before it could close for the climactic confrontation. This strategic focus shaped everything about Japanese submarine operations. Their boats were large, capable of extreme range. Some could cruise 20,000 miles without refueling. They carried observation aircraft, sophisticated communications equipment, and the formidable Type 95 torpedo. Their crews trained endlessly in night surface attacks, confident that superior optics and night combat skills gave them an edge. But that edge depended entirely on not being detected first. The first Fletcher-Class destroyers arrived in the Pacific Combat Theater in late 1942, just as the Guadalcanal campaign reached its crescendo. They looked like other American destroyers' flush-deck hulls, 5-inch gun mounts, torpedo tubes amidships, but their electronics suite represented a quantum leap. The Mk-12 fire control radar could track and engage aircraft automatically. The SG surface search radar provided constant situation awareness. The QC sonar pinged steadily, methodically, converting the surrounding ocean into an acoustic map that updated every few seconds. For Japanese submarine commanders, the change came not as a dramatic revelation but as a slow, creeping terror. Submarines that had operated safely for months suddenly found themselves under attack in circumstances that should have guaranteed safety. Night attacks, once rare, became routine. Submarines diving deep to escape found depth charges exploding at precisely their depth, as if the Americans could somehow track them underwater, which of course they could. Commander Harada, standing in I-18's conning tower that February night, represented thousands of Japanese submariners confronting this new reality. His submarine, a Type B-1 cruiser boat, was among the Imperial Navy's finest, 350 feet long, capable of 16,000-mile range, armed with 6 torpedo tubes and a 5-inch deck gun. Under his command were 94 men, many of whom had survived battles from the war's earliest days. They were professionals, well-trained, accustomed to danger. But nothing had prepared them for this. The American destroyer, later identified as USS Fletcher herself, the named ship of her class, had detected I-18 at approximately 2,300 yards using her QC sonar. The submarine had been running submerged, attempting to position herself for an attack on Allied shipping. She was making perhaps 4 knots, her electric motors barely humming, every crew member moving with practiced silence. Standard doctrine, perfect execution. And still, the Americans found her. Lieutenant Robert Hagan, gunnery officer aboard Fletcher, would later describe the contact with clinical precision. The sonar operator reported a solid return, bearing 095 degrees, range 2,300 yards, depth estimated at 150 feet. The destroyer's captain immediately ordered a turn toward the contact, increasing speed to 15 knots, fast enough to close quickly, slow enough to maintain sonar contact. As Fletcher bore down on I-18's position, her depth-charge crews readied their weapons, 6 K-guns that could hurl 300-pound charges to either side, plus stern racks that could roll additional charges directly over the submarine's estimated position. Inside I-18, the crew heard death approaching. The sonar pings grew louder, more rapid, more insistent. Destroyer propellers, their distinct 4-bladed throb, closed from stern to bow. Commander Harada ordered emergency deep, take her down to 300 feet, rig for depth charge attack, absolute silence throughout the boat. Men stopped breathing. The only sounds were water rushing past the hull and those relentless pings. Then the ocean erupted. The first pattern of depth charges detonated at 200 feet, slightly shallow, but close enough to slam I-18 sideways like a kicked can. Light bulbs shattered, gauges cracked. Men flew across compartments. Before the crew could recover, a second pattern thundered down, this one set for 250 feet, closer. The pressure hull groaned, a sound like dying steel. Rivets popped. A high-pressure air line ruptured, the escaping air shrieking through the boat. What terrified Commander Harada most wasn't the violence of the attack, it was the precision. Each pattern fell closer than the last, as if the Americans could see exactly where I-18 twisted and turned in the dark. Because they could. Fletcher's sonar tracked every evasive maneuver, every change of depth, every desperate attempt to escape. The destroyer's attack team, sonar operator, plotting officer, depth charge director worked in practiced coordination, updating the submarine's position every few seconds, adjusting the attack to compensate for evasion. I-18's luck ran out after the third pattern. A K-gun charge detonated 15 feet from the pressure hull at almost exactly the submarine's depth. The explosive shock wave, traveling through water 4 times more efficiently than through air, crushed the submarine's after ballast tanks and ruptured her fuel bunkers. Oil and air, unmistakable signs of damage, boiled to the surface. Fletcher circled, dropping additional charges to prevent escape, while a patrol bomber from USS Helena arrived overhead, drawn by radio call. The submarine never surfaced. 94 men died in I-18 that night, trapped in darkness and crushing pressure, their deaths caused by a weapon system they barely understood and couldn't effectively counter. Commander Harada, whose body would never be recovered, had joined countless submariners learning warfare's cruelest lesson. Technology trumps bravery. But I-18 was only the beginning. The Fletcher-Class destroyers, produced at a rate unmatched in naval history, spread across the Pacific like a vast net. By mid-1943, dozens operated in combat zones from the Aleutians to the South Pacific. By 1944, over 100 patrolled the shipping lanes and battle zones. Each carried the same electronics, trained to the same standards, hunting with the same relentless efficiency. Japanese submariners coined various terms for these destroyers, though none captured the full measure of their fear. Some called them ghost hunters, ships that found targets invisible to human senses. Others simply called them the ears, acknowledging the sonar that rendered stealth meaningless. But whatever name they used, the meaning was clear. The ocean had stopped protecting them. The statistics tell the story. Fletcher-class destroyers accounted for 29 Japanese submarines sunk during the war, more than any other Allied destroyer class. But raw numbers don't capture the psychological impact. Every submarine that survived an encounter with a Fletcher returned with the same report. The Americans could detect them at impossible ranges, track them through evasive maneuvers, and attack with precision that seemed almost supernatural. It wasn't supernatural. It was engineering. The QC sonar that equipped Fletcher-class destroyers represented years of development at the Naval Research Laboratory and private contractors like the Submarine Signal Company. The system transmitted ultrasonic pulses, sound waves at frequencies above 20 kHz, inaudible to human ears, but perfectly suited for underwater detection. When these pulses struck a submarine's steel hull, they reflected back to the destroyer's receiver, where operators with headphones listened for the characteristic echo. Sophisticated ranging mechanisms automatically calculated distance based on the time delay between transmission and echo return. Under ideal conditions, calm seas, deep water, no thermal layers to refract sound, a skilled operator could detect submarines at 2,500 yards and track them through moderate evasive action. Even under poor conditions, reliable detection exceeded 1,000 yards. For comparison, visual detection of a submerged submarine's periscope rarely exceeded 300 yards, and then only in perfect visibility. The Japanese had sonar too. Their submarines carried hydrophones for passive listening and some active sonar sets for ranging. But Japanese anti-submarine doctrine, like so much of their naval thinking, lagged critically behind American developments. Japanese destroyers, designed and trained primarily for surface torpedo combat and fleet screening, treated anti-submarine warfare as a secondary mission. Their sonar equipment, when fitted, was often inferior to American sets, and their operators lacked the intensive training that American sonar men received. More fundamentally, Japanese naval leadership failed to grasp how completely sonar had transformed submarine warfare. They continued deploying submarines using DSPROS, Tactics developed when concealment depended on visual limitations. They surfaced at night to recharge batteries, assuming darkness protected them. They maneuvered slowly when submerged, assuming silence mattered more than depth. They positioned submarines in picket lines ahead of American fleet movements, assuming patience would bring targets into range. All of these assumptions proved fatal against Fletcher-Class destroyers equipped with modern electronics. The February 11, 1943 sinking of I-18 was unusual only in its documentation. USS Fletcher's action report, filed that same day, provided detailed technical data. Sonar contact at 2,300 yards, tracking maintained through evasive maneuvers, positive evidence of destruction, including oil slicks and debris. But dozens of similar encounters went unrecorded in such detail, acknowledged only by submarines that failed to return to port and oil slicks that marked their graves. Some Japanese submarine commanders adapted. They learned to dive immediately upon detecting radar emissions, though Japanese radar warning receivers didn't become common until late 1944. They began recharging batteries during daytime while submerged at snorkel depth, though this reduced charging efficiency and left them vulnerable to air attack. They operated deeper when possible, though this sacrificed speed and made navigation difficult. But adaptation couldn't overcome fundamental technological inferiority. The Fletcher-Class destroyers could hunt at speeds Japanese submarines couldn't match while submerged. Their sonar could detect submarines trying to hide deep. Their depth charges could be set for any depth from 50 to 600 feet, making no refuge safe. And there were so many of them. 175 Fletcher-Class destroyers commissioned between 1942 and 44, an average of one new ship every 10 days during peak production. Against this industrial and technological tide, Japanese submariners fought with courage that their circumstances rendered futile. They pressed attacks on warships even when merchantmen offered easier targets. They maintained patrol stations even when detection seemed certain. They surfaced to fight gun battles with aircraft that could have simply summoned destroyers. Time and again, Japanese submarine crews demonstrated remarkable bravery in the service of a doctrine that technology had rendered obsolete. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The contrast with American submarine operations in the same theater is instructive. U.S. submarines, operating under more flexible doctrine, targeted Japanese merchant shipping and devastated it. By war's end, American submarines had sunk over 1,200 Japanese merchant ships, totaling 5 million tons, more than half of Japan's entire merchant marine. They did this while suffering lower losses than the Japanese submarine fleet, despite operating in the same waters. The difference wasn't courage or skill. It was doctrine, technology, and industrial capacity. American submarines had better torpedoes once the Mark 14's flaws were corrected. They had better radar. They had better intelligence, often knowing exactly where Japanese convoys would be. And crucially, they faced Japanese anti-submarine forces that were less numerous, less well-equipped, and less well-trained than American ASW units. But no weapon system devastated the Japanese submarine fleet quite like the Fletcher-Class destroyer. These ships represented everything Japan couldn't match: rapid mass production, technological sophistication, and operational flexibility. Where Japanese yards took years to build a submarine, American yards launched a new Fletcher every 10 days during peak production. Where Japanese sonar struggled to detect targets beyond 1,000 yards, American sonar reliably reached 2,500 yards. Where Japanese doctrine rigidly prescribed submarine tactics, American doctrine evolved rapidly based on combat experience. By 1944, Japanese submarine operations had degraded from strategic asset to desperate supply runs. With American forces island-hopping across the Pacific, isolated Japanese garrisons needed supplies. Surface vessels couldn't penetrate the American naval blockade. Aircraft couldn't carry enough cargo. So submarines, designed for scouting and attacking warships, were reduced to hauling rice and ammunition to starving soldiers. This represented perhaps the war's bitterest irony for the Imperial Japanese Navy. Submarines intended to sink American battleships wound up feeding beleaguered garrisons, while American destroyers hunted them remorselessly. The USS O'Bannon, another Fletcher-Class destroyer, exemplified this new era. On April 5, 1943, O'Bannon detected the Japanese submarine Ro-34 on the surface at night. In earlier years, this encounter might have been a fair fight, submarine versus destroyer, torpedoes against guns, each with reasonable odds of victory. But O'Bannon had radar. She detected Ro-34 at over 10,000 yards, far beyond visual range, and closed at 30 knots before the submarine crew even knew they'd been spotted. When Ro-34's lookouts finally saw the destroyer bearing down through the darkness, it was far too late to dive. The engagement that followed became legend, though not for the reasons most remember. American sailors claimed they threw potatoes at the Japanese crew when the submarine pulled alongside too close for O'Bannon's guns to depress. The story spread through the fleet, a moment of dark humor in a brutal war. But what actually happened was far more revealing of the technological chasm that had opened between the two navies. O'Bannon's radar had given her every advantage. The destroyer's fire control system, linked to her SG radar, provided constant updates on range, bearing, and speed. Her captain knew exactly where Ro-34 was at every moment, could predict her maneuvers, could position his ship for optimal attack. The Japanese submarine, meanwhile, fought blind. Her crew had excellent night binoculars, trained eyes, and considerable courage. But they couldn't see radar waves. They couldn't detect O'Bannon until she was close enough that her wake glowed with phosphorescence. When Ro-34 attempted to crash dive, her ballast tanks flooding in a desperate bid for the safety of depth, O'Bannon's 5-inch guns opened fire. The shells, aimed by radar-directed fire control, struck with devastating accuracy. The first salvo tore through the submarine's pressure hull just aft of the conning tower. The second destroyed her forward torpedo room. Within 90 seconds of the first shot, Ro-34 slipped beneath the waves stern first. Her entire crew of 42 men trapped inside a steel coffin that would take them down to crushing depths. There were no survivors. No bodies were recovered. The only evidence of Ro-34's existence was an oil slick that spread across the dark water and debris that bobbed to the surface a shattered lifeboat, pieces of decking, personal effects that would never reach the families waiting in Japan. This became the pattern. Japanese submarines, operating according to doctrine developed in an earlier era, found themselves hunted by weapons their training hadn't prepared them to counter. The night surface operations that had been their specialty became death traps. The deep-diving evasions that had saved them from depth charges in earlier battles now merely prolonged the agony as destroyers tracked them with sonar and adjusted their attacks accordingly. Lieutenant Commander Zenji Orita, who survived the war as captain of the submarine I-177, later wrote of these encounters with a mixture of bitterness and respect. "We knew the Americans had detection devices," he recalled. "We knew they had improved their methods. But we did not understand, could not understand, how completely the rules had changed. We continued to operate, as if darkness and depth provided safety. They did not. The Americans had taken away our sanctuary." In 1942, before the Fletcher-Class destroyers arrived in significant numbers, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 23 submarines to all causes. In 1943, with Fletchers proliferating across the Pacific, Japanese submarine losses nearly doubled to 42 boats. In 1944, as American anti-submarine warfare reached its peak effectiveness, 61 Japanese submarines were sunk. By 1945, so few operational submarines remained that losses declined simply because targets had become scarce. The Fletcher-Class destroyers didn't accomplish this alone, of course. American submarines sank Japanese submarines in what the U.S. Navy called mutual kills, though these were rare, as submarine versus submarine combat required extraordinary luck or skill. Aircraft equipped with radar and depth charges accounted for numerous kills, particularly as carrier-based planes gained range and effectiveness. Mines claimed their share of victims in approaches to Japanese bases, but destroyers, and particularly Fletcher-Class destroyers, remained the primary killers of Japanese submarines throughout the war. Their combination of sonar, radar, speed, and weapons proved uniquely suited to anti-submarine warfare. They could detect submarines at long range, close quickly, maintain contact through evasive maneuvers, and deliver precise attacks. Most critically, they operated in large numbers. Where a submarine might evade one destroyer through skilled maneuvering and luck, evading 3 or 4 destroyers working in coordination proved nearly impossible. The Americans developed tactics that maximized these advantages. When a destroyer gained sonar contact, she would immediately radio nearby ships, vectoring them to the target. Multiple destroyers would then conduct what became known as team attacks, one ship maintaining sonar contact and directing the others, which could maneuver freely to attack from optimal positions. The submarine, tracked continuously by sonar, faced depth charges coming from multiple directions, making evasion futile. Japanese submarine captains learned to dread the moment when sonar contact was gained. That initial ping, faint but unmistakable, meant the Americans knew approximately where you were. Within seconds, more pings would follow, each one refining the estimate. Within a minute, you'd hear propeller noises, the throbbing sound of destroyer screws churning water at high speed. Within 5 minutes, depth charges would begin falling, and unless you were extraordinarily lucky or the conditions extraordinarily favorable, your submarine's life could be measured in the minutes remaining until a charge detonated close enough to rupture your hull. Some captains tried to fight back. Japanese submarines carried deck guns, most mounted a 5-inch weapon, roughly equivalent to a destroyer's main battery. In theory, a submarine that surfaced could engage a destroyer in a gun duel. In practice, this proved suicidal. The destroyer had radar-directed fire control, which meant her guns could track and engage targets in complete darkness with reasonable accuracy. The submarine relied on optical sights, which meant her crew had to see the target to shoot at it. By the time a submarine crew spotted a Fletcher-Class destroyer at night, they were already within the destroyer's accurate fire envelope and under attack. Several Japanese submarines tried this desperate tactic. All were sunk. The most one-sided engagement occurred in May 1944, when the submarine I-176 surfaced to fight the destroyer USS England, not a Fletcher-Class, but equally well-equipped. England's radar detected I-176 at 12 miles. Her captain closed at high speed, using radar to maintain perfect situational awareness. When I-176's deck gun opened fire, the submarine crew was shooting blind, their shells splashing harmlessly hundreds of yards off target. England's radar-directed guns found the range on the second salvo. The third salvo scored direct hits, and I-176 sank within minutes, her deck gun silent, her crew dead or dying in water already filling the shattered hull. These encounters, dozens of them, occurring across thousands of square miles of ocean, fundamentally altered the strategic calculus of submarine warfare. Japanese naval headquarters, confronted with mounting losses and declining effectiveness, attempted to adapt. They issued new doctrine emphasizing deeper operations, faster transits, more frequent changes in patrol areas. They accelerated development of radar warning receivers, devices that could detect American radar emissions and give submarine crews a few precious seconds of warning. They experimented with radar-absorbent coatings for conning towers. Though these proved ineffective, nothing worked. The technological gap was too wide, the industrial disparity too great, and the tactical disadvantage too severe. By mid-1944, Japanese submarine doctrine had effectively collapsed. The grand strategy of wearing down the American battle fleet through submarine attrition had become a macabre joke. American battleships, when they appeared at all, travelled in task forces so heavily screened by destroyers and aircraft that submarine attacks were tantamount to suicide. The few submarines that attempted attacks on these formations were usually detected and sunk before they could reach firing position. Those that did manage to launch torpedoes seldom hit anything. The targets were fast, manoeuvrable, and alerted to the attack by escorts equipped with sonar. The Imperial Navy's submarine force, once envisioned as a decisive strategic weapon, had been reduced to supply transport. Submarines that should have been hunting American carriers instead ferried food to starving garrisons on bypassed islands. They carried ammunition to troops who would never receive reinforcement. They evacuated wounded and important personnel when surface vessels couldn't penetrate American naval blockades. These missions, unglamorous and often futile, consumed resources and submarines while contributing nothing to Japan's strategic position. The crews knew it. Submariners volunteering for transport runs understood they were participating in the slow-motion collapse of Japan's Pacific Empire. They loaded their boats with rice bags and medical supplies instead of torpedoes. They surfaced off isolated atolls to unload cargo, while lookouts scanned constantly for American destroyers that might appear at any moment. They submerged and ran silently, knowing that every ping from 8 sonar, every distant propeller noise, might herald their death. Morale, predictably, deteriorated. Where early war submarine crews had been elite volunteers, confident in their skills and their boats, late war crews often consisted of hastily trained replacements, filling spaces left by the dead. Training had been abbreviated as Japan's situation became desperate. New submarine captains went to sea with a fraction of the preparation their predecessors had received. Veteran submariners, the ones who had survived multiple patrols and learned through bitter experience how to evade American anti-submarine forces, were increasingly rare. The Fletcher-Class destroyers, meanwhile, only grew more numerous and more capable. Modifications made during wartime production runs incorporated lessons learned in combat. Later Fletchers had improved sonar installations, better radar systems, and enhanced anti-aircraft armament, this last in response to kamikaze attacks rather than submarine threats. Crew training intensified as the U.S. Navy refined its anti-submarine doctrine. Sonar operators became extraordinarily skilled at interpreting returns, distinguishing between actual submarines and false contacts caused by thermal layers, schools of fish, or ocean-bottom topography. The cumulative effect was a weapon system that grew more lethal, even as its targets became scarcer and more cautious. Fletcher-class destroyers hunted Japanese submarines with an efficiency that bordered on clinical. When sonar detected a contact, the crew would execute well-rehearsed procedures. Classify the contact, close to attack range, coordinate with nearby ships if available, execute depth charge attack patterns calculated to bracket the submarine's probable location. More often than not, the submarine died. Oil slicks and debris would mark another victory. The destroyer would note the position, report the kill, and resume patrol. For the Japanese submariners, every patrol became an exercise in survival rather than combat effectiveness. The mission might be to intercept an American carrier group or to deliver supplies to an isolated garrison. The reality was simply trying to reach the objective area, complete the mission if possible, and return to base alive. Success rates plummeted. Submarines that left port often never returned, their fates unknown until after the war, when American records could be compared with Japanese losses. I-52, a large cargo submarine, exemplified this futility. In March 1944, she departed Japan, bound for occupied France, carrying strategic materials for Germany and picking up German technology for the return voyage. The mission represented everything wrong with Japan's strategic position, her submarines reduced to long-range transport, her alliance with Germany requiring submarines to transit the entire Atlantic Ocean. I-52 never reached France. American intelligence, having broken Japanese codes, knew her route. American forces staged an ambush in the Atlantic. Aircraft equipped with sonar buoys and radar located I-52 on the night of June 23, 1944. Avenger torpedo bombers from the escort carrier USS Bogue sank her with acoustic homing torpedoes. All hands were lost. The sinking of I-52 illustrated how completely the Americans had mastered anti-submarine warfare. They knew where the submarine would be before she arrived. They had the technology to find her in an empty ocean at night. They had weapons that could track and kill a submerged submarine without requiring visual contact. Against such capabilities, courage and skill meant nothing. Japanese Naval Command recognized the problem, but lacked solutions. A post-war interrogation of Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi, who had overseen submarine operations, revealed the depth of their frustration. We knew about American sonar, Takagi stated. We knew about their radar. We knew they had more destroyers than we could possibly sink. But we had no alternative. Our submarines were designed for fleet operations. Our doctrine assumed those operations would be possible. When the Americans made fleet operations suicidal, we had no backup plan. We simply continued as before, knowing we were sending men to their deaths. This admission, sending men to die in service of an obsolete doctrine, captured the tragedy of the Japanese submarine service. Individual submariners were brave, skilled, and dedicated. Their boats, while technologically inferior to American submarines in some respects, were capable vessels with impressive range and endurance. But they were employed according to a strategic concept that technology had rendered unworkable, hunted by weapons they couldn't effectively counter, and sacrificed in missions that couldn't alter the war's outcome. The contrast with American submarine operations remained stark until the war's end. U.S. submarines continued, devastating Japanese merchant shipping, sinking an average of 50 ships per month during 1944. They operated aggressively, taking risks that paid off because they had technological advantages, better torpedoes, better radar, better intelligence. When American submarines encountered Japanese anti-submarine forces, the Americans usually escaped or fought successfully because Japanese destroyers lacked the sophisticated sonar and radar that made Fletcher-Class destroyers so lethal. The strategic implications were profound. Japan's island empire depended on maritime transport. Raw materials from occupied territories had to reach the home islands. Finished goods and troops had to reach forward bases. When American submarines severed these sea lanes, Japan's war economy began strangling. Factories shut down for lack of raw materials. Troops starved on isolated islands. The fleet remained in port for lack of fuel oil. And Japanese submarines, which might have contested American control of the sea lanes, were instead hunted to near extinction by Fletcher-Class destroyers and other anti-submarine forces. By August 1945, when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, the Imperial Japanese Navy submarine force had effectively ceased to exist as a combat-capable organization. Of the approximately 100 to 30 submarines built during the war, fewer than 10 remained operational. The rest lay on the ocean floor, their crews entombed in steel hulls, casualties of a technological and doctrinal mismatch they never overcame. The Fletcher-Class destroyers, proven in combat and built in extraordinary numbers, continued serving long after the war ended. Many were transferred to Allied navies, ironically, including to Japan itself, which received former Fletcher-Class destroyers in the 1950s to help rebuild its maritime self-defense force. Others remained in U.S. Navy service through the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and beyond. The last Fletcher-Class destroyer wasn't decommissioned until 2001, nearly 60 years after the first ship of the class was commissioned. Their legacy extended beyond mere longevity. The Fletcher-Class destroyers proved that mass production could be combined with technological sophistication, that standardized designs could be both effective and adaptable, and that electronics, radar, and sonar had fundamentally changed naval warfare. They represented a watershed moment when seeing the enemy mattered less than detecting the enemy, when technological superiority could trump tactical skill, when industrial capacity could overwhelm traditional martial virtues. For the Japanese submariners who faced them, Fletcher-Class destroyers came to symbolize everything about the Pacific War that Japan had miscalculated. The Americans weren't supposed to build so many ships so quickly. Their technology wasn't supposed to be so advanced. Their anti-submarine warfare wasn't supposed to be so effective. Yet all of these assumptions proved wrong, and Japanese submarines paid the price. The final assessment, rendered by historians examining records from both sides, is unambiguous. The Fletcher-Class destroyers, more than any other weapon system, destroyed the Japanese submarine force, not through any single dramatic battle, but through hundreds of encounters across thousands of miles of ocean, each one demonstrating the same lesson that in modern warfare, the side that can see wins, and the Americans had learned to see through darkness, through water, through steel itself. Commander Harada, dying in I-18 on that February night in 1943, was among the first to learn this lesson. He wouldn't be the last. In the months and years that followed, thousands of Japanese submariners would experience the same terrifying sequence, the ping of sonar echoing through their hull, the thunder of approaching propellers, the precision of depth charges that found them no matter how deep they dove or how desperately they maneuvered. The ocean, which they had thought would protect them, had been transformed into a battlefield where invisibility no longer guaranteed survival and darkness no longer provided sanctuary. The Fletcher-Class destroyers had seen to that, and in the end, seeing was everything. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.